Miss T. Today our grammar lesson is all about irregular verbs. So in our lesson today, we are going to talk about what irregular verbs are. We're going to go over some of the most common irregular verbs, the best way to remember them, and we're going to talk about why English has irregular verbs as well. Then at the end of this lesson, we're going to do some practice questions together to see how much you can remember. So let's first talk about what are irregular verbs. So irregular verbs are verbs that do not follow the standard pattern of adding either ed or d to form their past tense and past participle. So what we've seen in our other lessons, if you looked at the lesson about simple past tense, or you've looked at the overview of all the simple tenses, you'll find that when we change a verb to make it into past tense, the best rule for all regular verbs is adding ed to the verb or d to the end of the verb. However, irregular verbs are difficult because they don't follow this rule. That's why we call them irregular. So instead, they have different forms that often completely change the spelling of the verb. This is what makes them irregular. Their conjugation doesn't follow the usual rules. So conjugation is the process of changing the form of a word based on changes like the tense. So more information. What are irregular verbs? Unfortunately, when it comes to irregular verbs in English, it is not easy because there is no easy trick to understand irregular verbs. If you look at regular verbs, we have a very easy, simple trick. Just add d or ed. Very easy. However, irregular verbs are not that easy. They are extra difficult because the only way to know them and apply them correctly is by memorizing them. So this is very unfortunate, and I'm so sorry English is like this. So you have to memorize the irregular verbs. There are a lot. Luckily, a lot of the basic ones are like the most common ones. So you probably already know a few and you don't even realize it. But the more and more you practice English, the more your brain is going to remember these. You just have to practice often by speaking, by writing, by reading, and your brain will remember it. If you're not practicing it, then you're more likely to make errors. But that's how you memorize it, by practicing, practicing, practicing. Today's lesson will give you the most common action and non-action irregular verbs used in English. So I'm going to give you a list of these styles of verbs and show you the simple past form, which is the V2 form. And you can use the information that's provided in this video. You can write it down in your notebook, save it and memorize it, put it on your wall. If you study in one room in your house, that way you can always look to it and double check and make sure. So before we jump into any other detail, we're just going to review the structure. So whether the verbs are regular or irregular, they will always follow the same structure. Now, if you've been watching these grammar videos, you know the structure already. The structure is SVO, subject, main verb, object. And the main verb is what we're focusing on today for the irregular verbs. The only thing that's different is that the form changes or conjugates in a different way when it's in the past form V2. So that's the only difference between regular and irregular. So you don't have to worry about the structure very much. The structure is still going to stay the same no matter if the verbs are regular or irregular. So luckily we have that. So we have in these examples, we have 4 examples here. And in these examples, we have 2 irregular verbs and then 2 regular verbs. So we'll actually start from the bottom. She played the guitar. So in this case, we have subject, verb, object, and we have play, the verb, and it's a regular verb because we just add the ed. That's the simple rule. We always add the ed, so it's regular. The next one, we watched movies. We have subject, verb, object for this too. The verb here is in ed, so it's regular. We just add the ed at the end. He drank coffee. Now again, we have the same structure, subject, verb, object. However, drank, well, we didn't add an ed to this. It's not following that rule. Why? Because that's an example of an irregular verb. So for the irregular verb, it's going to look completely different. And that's why we have to memorize it. Because if you look over here to this top example, I spoke Spanish. We have the same structure, subject, verb, object. However, now this is in its V2 form. This is in the simple past form. However, again, it's completely different. Now we have spoke, S-P-O-K-E. So they obviously didn't conjugate in the same way. They're both irregular, but the spelling rules are completely different. It's not as simple as just adding ed to the end. The spelling completely changes in ways that we don't know until we memorize. That's why it's so difficult. So this lesson is going to focus on verbs in V2 form. In other words, we're going to be looking at how irregular verbs change in simple past tense. When you study English more, you're going to come across more tenses, which makes it even more confusing for irregular verbs because they follow different rules in different tenses. So we're going to start simple and then work our way up. Now, I'm going to tell you some of the most common non-action verbs that are irregular. If you're not too sure what a non-action verb is, I'm going to tell you. A non-action verb is also known as a stative verb. And what it does is it describes states, conditions, emotions, senses, or possession rather than actual actions. So an action is run, jump, walk, talk. These are all actions because you're moving clearly and doing some kind of action when you're doing these things. But now stative verbs describe a state, like the form of being, for example. And so we call them non-action or stative verbs because they don't change. They're static, not changing. Let's look at an example of irregular non-action or stative verbs. We've seen be. Now, when we change it to the V2 form, we know that it's was or were. And there's two options here because it depends on whether it's singular or plural. So I was, they were. Then we have. So this is in its V1 base form. And then we can change it to had as well. And this is in the simple past form. Know changes to knew. Think changes to thought with the O-U-G-H-T. That one's a little bit difficult. See, to see something with your eyes, changes to saw. Understand changes to understood. So we can see here, when they go into the V2 form, they all look completely different in how we spell them over here. That's why they need to be memorized. These are the most common ones. So you should write down this table and put it on your wall, or you can screenshot it and print it out and tape it to your wall to help you remember. Now, there's also really common irregular verbs that are just action verbs. So we have, for example, go is in V1 form and went is there. So you would say like, I went to the store, for example. Instead of take, we say took. He took my toy, for example. Instead of do, in the past, in the V2 form, we say did. So, for example, I did my homework, we can say. Instead of come, we say came. He came here yesterday, for example. Instead of begin, we can say began. I began the movie. Instead of eat, we say ate. I ate breakfast. Instead of give, we can say gave. I gave him a gift. Instead of speak, we can say spoke. Spoke to my mom, for example. So for all of these, now this is the V2 form. And again, we can see went, took, did, came. The spelling and the way it changes is completely different. Even though these are in all V2 form, they all follow very different rules for changing and conjugating, and then the spelling changes as well. That's why we can't just have a simple rule. We have to memorize all of these. So you can use this chart as well to help you memorize and work through these verbs. And a lot of them you probably know. So you probably already know went and did and came, gave and ate and things like that. And if you don't, continue to practice. Now, between these two charts, the stative or non-action verb chart and this action verb chart for irregular verbs, of course, these aren't all of the action verbs. There's too many. There's so many in English, but these are some of the examples of the most common ones. And then once you begin to build your vocabulary and speak and practice, you're going to have more and more in your language. And as always, if something doesn't seem right or doesn't sound correct, or you want to double check it, there's lots of resources for you to double check it. You can Google it or anything like that. It will tell you. Now, we're going to go into a little bit of a history lesson in case you're one of the many people who wonder, why is English like this? English is very difficult, and a lot of people, I've been a teacher for almost 10 years, and a lot of people say, well, why don't they just make ed on everything or d on the end of everything and make it very simple? And that is because of English's very long history. Because English has such a long history, it has changed a lot over hundreds of years. So English was created from many other languages. It was created from words from a Norse language, from German, from Latin. And because of this, English has many different rules and spelling can be very difficult. So for example, in some cases, we can simply add ed, and in other cases, we have a word like thought, Thought, but you're not even pronouncing the G or the H at all. These are silent letters. And so it becomes very confusing. And that's because of the history of English. And so why does English have irregular verbs? More information on the history. Because English is hundreds of years old, it has changed a lot, like we talked about. English is also used differently based on where someone lives. So for example, I am located here in Canada. And so the way I use English, the way I use certain vocabulary words or the way I spell certain words is going to be different from somebody who's using English in Australia or the UK. And so, for example, here in Canada and North America, and a lot of words we like to use Z in our spelling, and the word organize, for example. We spell it Organize. However, in the UK or Australia, they prefer to use the S instead of Z. So that's a small difference. And that's because we have so many dialects in English. And your language might have a lot of dialects too. So if maybe you live in India or in China, for example, these countries have a lot of different dialects and different ways to use a language. There are some words that are so common that they don't change though. So we did have a lot of words that changed in English over time, but there's some words that we use every day in almost every sentence, it seems. Because they're so common, we don't change them. So even after hundreds of years, a lot of these words haven't changed, and that's our irregular verbs. So our irregular verbs are examples of words that have gone hundreds of years in English without being changed at all. We just keep it. Maybe they will change in the far future in another 100 years, maybe, or 200 years. But for now, we have to learn this way. And that's why. So a long time ago, English speakers made a rule to conjugate most verbs in English in the same way to make it simple. That's why we have the rule to add D or ED on most regular verbs. So they thought, okay, we're going to make this easy. And this is when we started to standardize English. However, we decided, or they decided, not to apply that rule to the very common words. Examples are be, do, have, come, and think. They thought that since people are using those words so much every day in every sentence, that it should be easier to memorize. And so now, hundreds of years later, here you are learning about irregular verbs, and here I am telling you, you must memorize them because this is the only way. So to summarize what we've learned today, when you're looking at V2 forms and when we're using the simple past tense and other tenses, we can see how different irregular verbs are from regular verbs. When you're applying irregular verbs, the best thing to do is memorize the verb tables in this video to start, and then expand your vocabulary later. If you memorize the V2 forms of these verbs and use them often, you're less likely to make mistakes when you write and speak in English. It will become more natural to you. And why we have irregular verbs? Well, what we've just most recently learned, English was created by a lot of languages with a lot of different rules. Now English has a lot of different rules. Also, English has changed in many ways over hundreds of years, but some things like irregular verbs have not changed at all. So that is a little bit of a summary there for you. Now, let's see what you remember. So fill in the blank with the correct form of the irregular verb. Okay, so here's our first example sentence. I have a cat when I was young. So we should change this to the V2 form. Here it tells us the V1 form, but we have to change it to the V2 form. And have is an irregular verb, so it's not a matter of just adding D to the end, H-A-V-E-D. We have to conjugate it in a different way, different spelling. So how do we do that? Let's see. Here's the answer. I had a cat when I was young. So here, the simple past version of have is had, H-A-D. And so that is the correct form that we're going to use, the correct V2 form. Here's another example. I eat eggs for breakfast. Now we're going to change this to the V2 form. We're going to change it to simple past. So we have the base form, the V1, eat. But how do we change that for simple past? Let's look. I ate eggs for breakfast. So that is the correct V2 form there. Now I have one more question. I go to school at 8:00 a.m. yesterday morning. So now we know we have a signal word yesterday. We have the base form of the verb here, but we do need the V2 form, the simple past form of the word. And it's irregular. So you have to pull it from your brain after memorizing it. So what is the form that we're going to put here? What's the word? What's the spelling? Let's see. I went to school at 8:00 a.m. yesterday morning. So went is the correct form of that one. So keep on memorizing, keep on practicing the most you can, and these irregular verbs will come. They will. But besides that, we're all finished for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. There'll be more grammar videos to come. Take care. See you next time. Bye bye.